June 6, 1944. 7:08 a.m. The English Channel, off the coast of Normandy. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder stood in his landing craft and looked up at what he had to climb. Pointe du Hoc was a promontory of Norman limestone that jutted into the English Channel between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, its cliffs rising 30 meters straight out of the water with an overhang at the top that made the last 10 feet the hardest 10 feet. At the top of those cliffs, according to the intelligence photographs that had been studied for months at every level of Allied planning, was 6 155mm artillery pieces, each one capable of firing shells weighing 95 pounds to a range of 25 kilometers, each one positioned to sweep the beaches where the D-Day landings were about to begin. The 6 guns at Pointe du Hoc could kill more Americans on June 6th than all the German infantry defending the beaches combined. They had to be destroyed before the landings began, or at the very latest within the first hour of the landings, before the German gunners who had survived the preliminary bombardment could use them on the men coming ashore at Utah and Omaha. The plan that Allied planners had developed for destroying the guns at Pointe du Hoc was the plan that had been determined to be the only plan that could work. Destroy them from above with bombers, suppress them with naval gunfire, and then send men up the cliffs to confirm the destruction and eliminate any survivors. The bombing had not destroyed the guns. The naval gunfire had not destroyed the guns. The suppression that was supposed to cover the approach to the cliffs had been partially effective and partially not, which in the specific mathematics of men climbing ropes up a 30-meter cliff under fire meant that some of the men climbed successfully and some of them died on the rope. Rudder had 225 Rangers of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. He needed to get them up those cliffs, and he needed to do it in a way that gave them a fighting chance of surviving the climb and taking the position at the top. The preparation for the Pointe du Hoc assault had been intensive in the way that all preparations for things that are going to be extraordinarily dangerous need to be intensive. The Rangers had trained on the cliffs of Swanage in Dorset, climbing limestone faces that resembled the Norman cliffs as closely as British geology allowed, under conditions that were as demanding as realistic training could make them. They had practiced with the equipment that the assault would require: rocket-propelled grappling hooks fired from the boats to embed in the cliff top, rope ladders deployed from the hooks, and the men climbing the ladders under the weight of their weapons and their equipment while the boats held position in the channel surf. The equipment worked in training. It worked less reliably under fire from defenders who had not been destroyed by the preliminary bombardment. The landing craft carrying Rudder's Rangers hit the base of the cliff at 7:08 a.m., 40 minutes later than planned because of navigational errors that had initially pointed the boats toward the wrong section of coast. The 40-minute delay was significant because the plan had called for the Rangers to be at the top of the cliffs before the main D-Day landings began, and the landings had already started. The guns at Pointe du Hoc, if they were still operational, were already in range of the beaches. The grappling hooks went up first. Most of them made it to the top. Some of the ropes were cut by German defenders who appeared at the cliff edge and severed the lines before the Rangers could climb them. Some of the ropes were rendered useless when the water-soaked hemp became too heavy to climb before it could be fully deployed. But enough held, and the Rangers who had been waiting in the boats began climbing. The climb up the ropes at Pointe du Hoc was the physical act that has defined the Ranger assault in every subsequent account, and it deserves to be understood in its specific physical reality rather than as a cinematic moment. The ropes were wet and heavy. The cliff was not smooth, but neither was it flat, and the Rangers who climbed it were doing so while German defenders above them threw grenades and fired rifles and cut ropes and did everything that prepared defenders can do to men who are hanging on a rope 30 meters above the channel. The men who were hit on the ropes fell. The men who were not hit kept climbing. Sergeant Len Lomell was one of the first Rangers to reach the top of the cliff. He was 23 years old and had grown up in New Jersey and had been training for this specific moment for months. He came over the cliff edge and immediately found himself in a landscape that the pre-assault photographs had not fully conveyed, a moonscape of bomb craters and shattered limestone and destroyed fortifications that the preliminary bombardment had created but that had not destroyed the guns. The guns were not in their positions. Lomell and the Rangers who came over the cliff behind him found empty gun emplacements. The 155mm pieces that had been the reason for everything, the reason for the training and the planning and the climbing and the dying on the ropes, were not there. Intelligence had not known, could not have known, that the Germans had moved the guns inland several days before the assault in response to the preliminary bombardment that had destroyed the emplacements but not the guns. A lesser man might have concluded at this point that the mission had failed, that the objective did not exist, that the Rangers who had died climbing the cliffs had died for nothing. Lomell did not conclude this. He concluded that the guns existed somewhere inland and that finding and destroying them was the mission regardless of where they were. He moved inland with his section and Sergeant Jack Coon, leaving the cliff top to the other Rangers who were still securing the position against the German infantry that was counterattacking from multiple directions. What Lomell found approximately 550 yards inland from the cliff edge was the most important discovery made by any individual soldier on D-Day. 5 of the 6 155mm guns, fully operational, camouflaged with brush and netting, positioned in an orchard with a clear line of fire to both Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, surrounded by ammunition that had been stockpiled for exactly the mission that the Allied commanders had most feared. The guns were unguarded. The German crews who had been assigned to them had apparently gone forward to observe the landing beaches before commencing fire. Lomell had 2 thermite grenades. He put one in the traversing mechanism of the first gun and one in the traversing mechanism of the second gun, destroying the mechanisms and rendering the guns unable to be aimed. He went back for more grenades from other Rangers and returned and disabled the remaining guns before the German gun crews returned. 5 155mm artillery pieces that could have killed thousands of Americans on the D-Day beaches were destroyed by one sergeant from New Jersey with 2 thermite grenades and the specific quality that all great soldiers possess, the ability to adapt the mission to the situation rather than abandoning the mission because the situation had changed. The action that Lomell and Kuhn took in that orchard was one of the most consequential individual actions of the entire D-Day operation. The damage that those 5 guns could have inflicted on the landing beaches and on the naval vessels offshore before being destroyed by other means was not theoretical. It was calculated by Allied planners who had spent months on exactly this question, and the numbers were severe enough that destroying those guns had been designated a mission priority equal to the beach landings themselves. The Rangers held Pointe du Hoc after the assault, but holding it was its own battle. The German forces in the area counterattacked continuously through June 6th and into June 7th, and the Rangers who had scaled the cliffs and destroyed the guns found themselves surrounded, cut off from reinforcement, fighting with the ammunition they had carried up the ropes because the resupply that the plan had specified had not arrived. Rudder, commanding from the cliff top with wounds from German fire that he refused to let be evacuated, sent a radio message that became one of the most noted communications of D-Day. His message was 3 words. Where is Fox? Fox was the code name for the relief force that was supposed to have reached Pointe du Hoc hours earlier. The answer was that Fox had been stopped by German resistance on the road from Omaha Beach. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc were alone. They held anyway. They held because that was what Rangers did when they were told to hold a position, and because Rudder was there with them bleeding from his wounds and giving orders, and because the men who had climbed those ropes were not the kind of men who gave up a position they had paid that much to take. The relief force reached Pointe du Hoc on June 8th, 2 days after the assault. Of the 225 Rangers who had started up the ropes on the morning of June 6th, 90 were still fit for duty when the relief arrived. 135 were dead or wounded, a casualty rate of 60% in 2 days of fighting. The men who had died climbing the ropes at Pointe du Hoc had made possible the survival of thousands of men on the beaches below. The guns they destroyed, or whose destruction they enabled by their presence on the cliff top preventing the German gun crews from operating them during the critical first hours, were guns that would have fired on the most densely packed concentrations of men and ships that the English Channel had ever seen. They knew what the guns could do. They had been briefed on the kill radius and the range and the weight of shell and the rate of fire. They had climbed the ropes anyway. That is what Rangers do. That is what the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion did on June 6, 1944, on a cliff that the Germans believed no assault force could climb under fire. They climbed it. They took the top. They destroyed the guns. The promontory at Pointe du Hoc still bears the marks of the preliminary bombardment, the craters that visitors can walk through today exactly as Lomell walked through them on the morning of June 6th looking for guns that were not in their positions. The cliff is preserved as a monument. The German observation bunker that Rudder used as his command post still stands. At the edge of the cliff, there is a monument to the Rangers who climbed it. The inscription is in both English and French, and it says what needs to be said about what happened there without attempting to say more than monuments can carry. It says that here on June 6, 1944, the 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled these cliffs. That is enough. That is everything. They scaled the cliffs. They did what nobody believed could be done under the conditions that existed on the morning of June 6th. They did it because the guns had to be destroyed and they were the unit assigned to destroy them. The guns were destroyed. The beaches were saved. Sergeant Len Lomell lived to be 91 years old. He was asked in his final years what he thought about when he thought about Pointe du Hoc. He said he thought about the men who didn't make it to the top. He thought about them on the ropes. He thought about what they were doing and why they were doing it and what it meant that they kept climbing even when they could see what was happening to the men above them. He said he thought they were the bravest men he ever knew. He was one of them. He was climbing that same rope. They were all the bravest men anyone ever knew. On a cliff in Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944, they proved it.